2:58 a.m, October 26, 2025. High above the Belgorod frontier, two Ukrainian reconnaissance UAVs hover soundlessly, their thermal feeds glowing with the shapes of trucks, tanks and fuel tankers hidden in the Russian rear zone. The target, a massive logistics hub nestled near the Belgorod Dam. Through the infrared view, 8 heavy military trucks can be seen parked in perfect rows loaded with thousands of pounds of artillery shells. Nearby, fuel tankers stand ready, their tanks brimming with diesel, feeding an entire battalion's lifeline. The base hums quietly, unaware that it is being watched, recorded and marked for destruction. But this time, Ukraine's plan is unlike anything before. Instead of targeting soldiers or vehicles, the goal is far more ambitious: to strike the Belgorod Dam itself. A single hit could unleash a wall of water powerful enough to erase the entire Russian supply node downstream. The idea is daring, almost reckless: use the enemy's own reservoir as a weapon of war. By 3:05 a.m, deep in a forest near Chuhuiv, 3 HIMARS launchers slowly rise from their camouflaged pits. Their coordinates have been confirmed, their systems checked twice over. Each launcher carries 2 GMLRSER precision rockets, the latest American-made guided munitions capable of hitting targets over 90 miles away with pinpoint accuracy. Each rocket is armed with a 200-pound warhead built specifically to pierce reinforced concrete before detonating inside. The Ukrainian artillery crews stand ready. Their faces are hidden under the dim green glow of digital panels. The command comes through the encrypted line from the 16th Field Corps headquarters. Fire mission confirmed. Objective, Belgorod Dam. The red ready fire light flicks on. Without hesitation, all 3 HIMARS roar to life at once, the shockwave echoing across the forest floor. 6 rockets streak upward, vanishing into the black sky. At the same time, far to the northwest, 2 decoy drones, UJ-22 models, launch from a makeshift airstrip. They are nothing more than lightweight foam aircraft, fitted with transmitters and radar reflectors, designed to look like incoming cruise missiles. Their purpose? To draw Russian air defences away from the real threat. Flying low and steady, the decoys emit electronic signals mimicking the radar profile and heat signature of Neptune anti-ship missiles. On Russian radar screens, the deception works perfectly. The 96 L6E radar station near Shebekino picks up 2 fast-approaching missiles. Sirens wail. The nearby Panzer S-1 air defence battery swivels its twin cannons and missile pods towards the northwest sky. Operators scramble to lock onto the phantom targets. The entire defence grid shifts its attention away from the south, the true direction from which the HIMARS rockets are closing in. 03:06 a.m. The Ukrainian rockets now fly barely 200 feet above the ground, moving at Mach 3, nearly 2,300 miles per hour. Their GPS guidance cuts off automatically after crossing the border, switching to terrain-following radar to stay invisible to Russian systems. The warheads adjust their flight paths autonomously, calculating perfect impact angles. The operation is silent, invisible, unstoppable. In the Russian control room at Belgorod Dam, 2 officers monitor pressure gauges, unaware that death is seconds away. The first sign comes not from the sky, but from the ground itself, a deep, low vibration like distant thunder. Before they can react, the first HIMARS round slams into the central spillway. The explosion tears through 4 feet of reinforced concrete, sending a flash of light into the night. 2 seconds later, the second rocket hits, then the third. In less than 5 seconds, 6 warheads detonate in a near-perfect line across the dam's crest. The structure shudders violently as if struck by an earthquake. A faint metallic groan builds into a deafening roar. Cracks begin to spread across the concrete face, thin at first, then wide enough for torrents of water to burst through. The engineers inside barely have time to shout before the entire wall gives way. At 3:07:14 a.m, the Belgorod Dam collapses. A white plume of water erupts skyward as the reservoir bursts open. A roaring wall of water, taller than a building, surges downstream. Over 500 million gallons of water tear through the valley, smashing trees, roads, and everything in its path. Within seconds, the once quiet Russian base becomes a death trap. Trucks, tents and soldiers are swallowed whole as the flood slams into the camp with the force of 1,000 artillery shells. Communications masts collapse, generators explode in flashes of light, fuel tanks rupture, igniting fiery streaks across the water surface. The entire logistics hub, men, machines, ammunition, vanishes beneath the raging current. Within 1 minute, a place that once sustained a battalion no longer exists, and Ukraine has just rewritten the rules of modern warfare. The river did the rest. What began as a pinpoint strike became a rolling catastrophe that spread outward with mechanical inevitability. Water carved new channels, ripped up bridges, and stole the supply lines the Russians had relied on for months. In the minutes after the breach, frantic radio chatter painted a picture of scrambled commands, and dying networks unit icons vanished from screens. GPS fixes blinked out, and patrols found their roads turned into torrents. Rear echelon units, the ones that keep engines running and guns firing, were suddenly adrift. Fuel that had been counted on for the next week burned or floated away. Ammunition stocks sank to mud. Repair crews and drivers, people trained for hauling and fixing, were left clinging to uprooted trees. Rescue boats tried to thread through a landscape that no longer matched any map. The Southern Military District tried to react. Orders cascaded down like flares shot into fog, but nothing could recover what the flood had taken in the first hour. Engineers with pontoon bridge kits were dispatched, airborne resupply was ordered, and sappers were woken for emergency dam assessments, yet every plan collided with the same hard fact. The ground had changed. Riverbanks were scoured. Fords that had offered quick fixes were buried under boulders and stinking debris. Approaches that supported heavy trucks turned into sucking mire. For frontline artillery crews, the impact was immediate, and brutal batteries that expected shells by dawn found only silence and the math that keeps a fire plan alive: rounds per day. Fuel per gun, medevac windows collapsed into unacceptable risk. Commanders who had practiced for 1,000 tactical contingencies had not rehearsed for their own arteries to be severed by a broken civil work. Meanwhile, at the local level, the human toll unfolded in stark frames. Drivers who had nodded off between shifts were swept away by a surge that gave no warning. A small logistics tent filled with spare parts and ration packs was ripped from its anchors and hurled into a new muddy channel. The field hospital's generator died as water found the lower electrical conduits and lit up floors with blue sparks before smoke took everything else. Survivors were pulled from trees and roofs by soldiers who hours before had been their colleagues. Some pockets of men clung to the higher terrain and radioed in desperate status updates, their voices thin and incredulous. In the Kremlin's operational picture, the strike registered not as a single loss, but as a strategic wound. Satellite feeds and SIGINT messages took hours to piece together the full scale. And even then, cloud cover, flare deployments, and the electromagnetic fog of war obscured key details. Ad hoc investigations began. Was this an accident from engineering failure, a rare natural collapse, or a kinesthetic form of warfare? Intelligence analysts who prided themselves on patterns and probabilities had to accept a brutal truth. Ukraine had weaponized geography. The use of terrain as force multiplier, until now largely academic, had become a doctrine in front of their screens. On the Ukrainian side, the operation was a textbook in combined arms deception and economy of force. Recon drones returned with raw footage. Thermal tracks of trucks being swept away, antennas snapped like twigs, and rolling plumes of mud where once was order. Proof that a small, precisely delivered strike could cascade into strategic paralysis without the expense of prolonged bombardment. Commanders in Kiev watched and recorded, already drafting lessons, vulnerability mapping, timing strikes to logistics cycles, and synchronizing electronic decoys to lure air defences away from the real vector. The narrative that followed among soldiers and planners was equal parts relief and grim calculation. Relief because an entire supply hub had been rendered unusable without massive troop losses on the Ukrainian side. Calculation because the success opened a new set of choices that demanded careful moral and legal weighing. In the days after, the ripple effects altered operations across a wide front. Resupply convoys were rerouted hundreds of kilometres, stretching lines and increasing convoy times. Frontline units were forced to conserve ammunition. Casualty evacuation became harder as medical shipments were delayed, and the Russian tempo of operations slowed as repair units and engineer brigades worked feverishly to re-establish crossings. Often under fire, international monitors and satellite services, when they could peer through clouds and jamming, catalogued the geomorphologic changes. New channels cut into floodplain forests, sediment choked in previously clear streams, and entire swathes of temporary infrastructure vanished. Local civilians, who had already endured waves of displacement and trauma, found the landscape further transformed. Roads that had been used for market access were now impassable. Small farms were buried in silty debris. The hours after the flood became a frantic race to turn chaos into advantage or to stop it from becoming a catastrophe that could spiral out of control. Ukrainian surveillance drones circled the devastated valley, their feeds a steady drumbeat of evidence, overturned trucks gouged into mud, fuel slicks burning in ragged lines, shattered comms arrays blinking their lustes. Commanders on both sides now moved with different aims. Kiev to exploit the sudden disruption, Moscow to staunch the bleeding and reassemble a workable supply chain. Ukrainian strike planners watched as columns of stunned Russian engineers and hastily formed repair crews pushed into the debris, attempting to rig temporary barriers and shepherd salvage teams through a landscape that no longer fit the maps. Every attempt to recover material was risky. Twisted metal and submerged ammunition presented the constant chance of secondary explosions. Ukraine did not stop at the initial breach. Small follow-up strikes targeted known recovery routes and salvage staging areas, deliberately complicating repair efforts while avoiding obvious civilian infrastructure where possible. Reconnaissance teams probed the new river geometry, looking for choke points and fording spots the Russians might try to use. Meanwhile, Russian commanders scrambled to disperse what supplies remained, establishing new forward caches, rationing fuel, and arming convoys with heavier escorts. Engineers prioritised rebuilding temporary crossings and pumping out critical nodes, working under the persistent threat of drone observation and counter-strike. Politically, the event rippled far beyond the battlefield. Allies and neutral observers tracked the images and reports. Some calling the operation a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, others demanding restraint and probing questions about the legal and humanitarian implications of weaponising civilian infrastructure. International organisations pushed for damage assessments and civilian aid access, while information campaigns from both capitals spun the narrative. Kiev framed the mission as a strategic necessity to hamper an invasion force. Moscow decried it as a dangerous escalation that risked civilian lives and environmental harm. Within Russian units, trust in rear area security collapsed. Logistics officers rethought doctrine, ordering supplies to be spread across smaller, less obvious caches, or moved through airlift corridors that could be interdicted only at higher cost. The time and fuel cost of those adaptations slowed Russian operational tempo for weeks. For Ukraine, the success created new doctrinal possibilities, but also deep moral calculus. Planners who had proven that a single precision strike could produce outsized effects now face the reality that replicating this method would likely invite intensified countermeasures. Hardened dams, rapid repair teams on permanent standby, redundant supply lines, and an increased use of civilian infrastructure for military ends. Each response carrying its own risks to non-combatants and the environment. Back on the ground, the human stories multiplied beyond the statistics. Soldiers who survived the initial flood found themselves in a strange liminal space, grieving comrades, salvaging what they could, and suddenly vulnerable to the stalking cold and the long logistical winter that followed. Civilians downstream who had not been evacuated in time faced ruined homes and livelihoods. Agricultural land was smothered in silt and metal, changing planting seasons and local economies. Environmental experts warned that the sudden release of so much water and contaminated debris could have long-term effects on river ecosystems and drinking water supplies, complicating the calculus of success. Strategically, the operation forced a shift in both campaign planning and public perception. Ukraine's ability to strike deep, to combine precision fires with electronic deception and terrain awareness, reshaped how commanders on both sides thought about rear area vulnerability. Supply hubs that once seemed secure because of distance from the front line were now re-evaluated as potential targets if they rested on critical infrastructure. Russia pressed into defensive improvisation, poured resources into hardening key nodes and expanding airborne logistics, which in turn stretched its resource pool thinner across multiple theatres. For Ukraine, the payoff was immediate. Local offensives gained breathing room as Russian resupply slowed, artillery concentrations thinned, and morale among frontline units rose, with each successful interdiction. Yet the victory also seeded a new caution. Each successful use of geography as a weapon opened moral debates at home and abroad and invited counter-escalation that could endanger